For people to file in this morning as we let them into the Zoom room, and then we'll get started. So we'll give this another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Gonna wait till 2 minutes after. We're at 1 and I don't know how many seconds. All right, so we're gonna get started this morning. Good morning and welcome. I am Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar this morning on impending evictions and the struggle to live in East Jerusalem, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, co-sponsored with Just Vision. So the struggle of Palestinians to remain in their longtime homes in Sheikh Jarrah is once again taking center stage. Settlers, with the backing of the Israeli government for years and a green light from Israeli courts, are on the precipice of evicting several Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood of East Jerusalem that has been a target of the settler movement for decades. This is also happening, by the way, in other areas of East Jerusalem, including the neighborhood of Silwan, which has also been in the news lately. To give first-person insights into the ongoing saga, we have with us today two Palestinian experts in the field, whom I will introduce very briefly here. For their full bios, please see the online invitation to this webinar on our website, fmep.org. So first, I want to introduce Mohammed El-Kurd. Mohammed is a writer and a poet from Jerusalem, and he is currently studying in New York City. He, I think, is known to a lot of people from Our Neighborhood, the movie in which he starred from, I think, 2011 when it was released. We'll be talking about that. And he has become a prolific writer with his work appearing in The Nation, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera, and most recently in Plus 972 magazine. Alongside Mohammed, we are honored to have Fayrouz Sharqawi, who is the Global Mobilization Coordinator at Grassroots Al-Quds, a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking in occupied Jerusalem. Grassroots Al-Quds believes that the challenges and responses of Palestinian communities must be articulated and led by Palestinians. They research, map, mobilize, and network in order to contribute to the creation and implementation of Palestinian long-term strategies for Jerusalem. So, as is FMEP's regular practice, the format for today's webinar will be a discussion between myself and the panelists. In addition to my own questions, we are always eager to take your questions. You can submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can submit them at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and will do my best to factor in as many of your questions as possible during the course of the discussion. And please note that the webinar is, of course, being recorded. It's actually being live broadcast on Facebook, and it will be posted online immediately after it ends, along with the resources that we'll be posting in the chat box. So you'll be able to come back to everything we mentioned. Finally, if you have technical problems with the webinar, let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. And as I always say, please do not put your questions into the chat box because I'm not monitoring that. So if you put them there, they are certain to not get asked. So with that, we are going to begin. And I'm using this very light tone because I'm so happy to have Mohammed here with us and have Fayrouz as experts, but this is not a light issue. And we're going to dive right into it. Mohammed, I want you to talk a little bit about the plight of your family, which was gut-wrenchingly told in My Neighborhood, the movie. And I'm going to ask you to share the story here and talk about what most recently happened in the last week or two, what has unfolded with this story in Sheikh Jarrah.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. You know, in brief terms, late October, the Israeli Magistrate Court ruled to evict my family in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah alongside 11 other families. And I think it's very important to place emphasis on the plurality of those home dispossessions and home takeovers. Currently, today in Sheikh Jarrah, there are almost 100 people just waiting, anticipating the moment they are thrown out of their homes, in the streets, in the middle of a harsh winter, in the middle of a pandemic. Not that it's okay outside of a pandemic setting. And they're also dreading, the astronomical fees that we have to pay in terms of legal fees for the settlers, and all of that burden that comes with the dispossession. It's not just the physical removal of your home, it's so much more. And sometimes it even leads up to a revoking of your Jerusalem ID. So it's completely an ethnic displacement process. And this is not the first time for my family. Our house was originally taken in 2009. Half of it was taken by Israeli settlers, backed by Israeli police and the Israeli government ultimately, alongside 4 other families. And it's also not the only home in Jerusalem that's facing this threat. But what's so, I wouldn't say unique, but what's so pressing about Sheikh Jarrah is that it's a nonstop framework of dispossession that has been framed as a legal battle, which I can talk about more extensively later. But yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a great introduction to the crisis that we're dealing with here. Fayrouz, can you talk more about this crisis? And specifically with Mohammed's family, what is the status of the effort? And the other families, how many are they? How many people? And where does this stand in courts today?
Yes, specifically in this case, we are now talking about 12 families that are awaiting the answer of the district court for their appeal on the eviction order that the magistrates court has issued recently. But we are talking about many more families that are facing eviction within other legal cases. I think it's important also to highlight that this is part of a bigger picture of dispossession and eviction and displacement of all Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, Sheikh Jarrah is a big neighborhood with many different legal cases and specific stories. But in this case, we are talking about 12 families who are part of the original 28 families of Palestinian refugees who were promised homes in Sheikh Jarrah by the Jordanian authorities in 1956. They never got the deeds to these homes, and that is why today they are facing the eviction from these homes. And we can elaborate about this, of course, later.
So actually, this is a great lead-in, because what I wanted to ask you next is actually to elaborate on Sheikh Jarrah a little bit more so people understand, because it is a diverse neighborhood, right? We're talking about one specific area, which is a neighborhood of refugees who were settled there by the Jordanians, but there's other areas of Sheikh Jarrah that are also being targeted by settlers. Can you sort of draw a picture for people of what is Sheikh Jarrah? Who are the people that live there? How long have they been there? What are their claims to residency based on?
Yes, so just like you said, Sheikh Jarrah is a diverse neighborhood. It's one of the neighborhoods that were built just outside of the old city. So there are also original Palestinian Jerusalemite families owning property in Sheikh Jarrah. These are families who started building homes there in the mid-19th century. But we are now talking about the special cases of Palestinian refugee families, refugees from everywhere in Palestine, the people from Jerusalem itself, from the western side of Jerusalem, ethnically cleansed in 48, or refugees from Haifa. I mean, Mohammed's grandmother, she was married to a person from Haifa. So we're talking about refugees from Haifa and the Ramle. So we are talking about Palestinian refugees who found themselves in the eastern part of Jerusalem following the Nakba of 1948. And then there were 28 families who supposedly won a draw to choose 28 families by the Jordanian authorities, which controlled Sheikh Jarrah as part of the eastern side of Jerusalem between 48 and 67. And in 1956, these 28 families were promised homes in return for their refugee status. So giving away their refugee legal status or cards in return to receiving homes that were promised to move to their own ownership after 3 years that they live in them. They moved to these homes. The Jordanian authorities never kept their promise. They never made or gave the deeds to these families, and now settler organizations are claiming owning the land in some cases, sometimes mostly the land in this specific legal case, which is a complex legal case again, and later on we will talk about the players, the actors in this game, the legal system, the judicial system, the Israeli government, and not only settler organizations. But this is the case in Sheikh Jarrah. 28 families, out of which 4 have been evicted already, as Mohammed started telling us, in 2008 and 2009. So we have already 4 homes that were taken by the settlers. These are settler homes now in the middle of the Palestinian neighborhood. You walk around the neighborhood, you see their Israeli flags everywhere, you see their surveillance cameras, you see their children and the people simply living in somebody else's homes. This is the picture in Sheikh Jarrah.
And I think it's really important for people to understand, because the idea that you're evicting, particularly with this particular group of Palestinians, this is sort of double refugee status, right? So people came there as refugees, and they are essentially going to become refugees a second time, as in effect you have an Israeli Jewish right of return claim to East Jerusalem, while Palestinians have no rights to properties lost at any point in East or West Jerusalem or anywhere inside Israel. I think that's really an important point for people to understand. Mohammed, I mean, we're all focused right now, like we're focusing this conversation on the crisis, but you had a relatively normal childhood as far as East Jerusalem goes. You lived in this home, this was your neighborhood, except that it was always targeted by settlers, right? So can you talk about what it was like growing up in Sheikh Jarrah, what your family's experience is there, what your family's history is there as you fight to stay in your home?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Before I answer that, I just want to say, yeah, indeed, I'm arguing that it's not only the second time some of us are getting thrown out of their homes. This is maybe the 5th or 6th time. And if my grandmother was alive, this would have been her 6th time getting thrown out of her home. My father, this is his 4th time, because our house was already taken before they were, because the journey of a Palestinian refugee is not just from one city to another. It's from one city to city to city to city to city to city. And it's terror after terror after terror until we find a place where we can settle. But in terms of my childhood, I liked my childhood, I think. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the most classic example of a childhood, but I could carve out a space for me within it, within all of that chaos, to have fun, I think. Sheikh Jarrah was like any other Palestinian neighborhood. It was very tight-knit, full of life. People were in each other's business. And our living room was never, ever empty. Especially, and growing up under this dispossession and under military occupation and just watching homes after homes being taken, I noticed that even the community became stronger and stronger with each dispossession, and our response to these dispossessions became more unanimous. My family, like a lot of what Fayrouz said, my grandmother was born in Jerusalem, and she married into Haifa, and then the Nakba happened, and she went from Haifa to Nazareth to Shfa Amr to a bunch of other villages. And then she came to Jerusalem in 1956, and the UNRWA Jordanian government gave them houses. They said, pay this tiny rent fee for 3 years, and we're going to give you ownership of the houses. We still have those documents, those promises in writing. My family still has them. A lot of our neighbors still have them. And then we settled in Sheikh Jarrah, even as bizarre as it sounds, because Sheikh Jarrah is so central to Jerusalem, they didn't want to, even though it is a housing project for refugees, they didn't want to treat it as such, which I think is a flaw in the way we're treating Sheikh Jarrah, because it is a refugee camp ultimately. But, my grandmother was asked to plant flowers in the garden. These were the terms of living there, like plant flowers, have a good relationship with your neighbor, pay this tiny amount of rent for 3 months, for 3 years, and then that's it. But as Fayrouz said, they never followed up on their promise, and then Israel annexed Jerusalem in 1967. But in terms of family history in Sheikh Jarrah, I've seen my siblings grow up there. I've seen my aunts pass away there. I've seen neighbors get married and neighbors get dispossessed and neighbors that I do not know addresses for anymore. I've seen, like, I know a lot of childhood friends that I cannot locate on a map today because they were thrown out of their homes from Ghawi and Hanun family. So yeah, I think that's a good glimpse into life in Sheikh Jarrah.
Thank you. I think it's difficult to imagine what it's like for maybe kids who are younger growing up there now with this constant threat of being thrown out of their homes. I mean, this is, I think for all of us, it's something to really take a moment and think about. Mohammed, can I stick with you for a second and have you talk more about your family's battle against the settlers, which was obviously highlighted in the movie? Your family has literally spent years defending your right to live in your home in Israeli courts. Can you talk about that? And I maybe this is not a fair question to ask, but I'd be interested in whether or not you believe that there is hope of victory here or any legitimate justice and legal recourse for you via these efforts.
I'm glad you asked this. I'm actually very glad you asked. You know, this quote unquote legal battle is one that is elongated and drawn out and has been happening since decades, since the 70s in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. And it is by design that it is so elongated because, first of all, it is psychologically tormenting, like you were just saying about being a child growing up in there, not knowing. I remember very distinctly my whole childhood revolving around waiting for a certain month in a year because that's when the court ruling would happen. And that happened across the length of like my first 11 years of my life. I would wait until May comes and then they would, you know, postpone the ruling, and I would wait until August comes and they would postpone the ruling. And then 11 years later, November came and they threw us out. So it is, first of all, it's psychologically tormenting. My mother is constantly talking about how she wishes they could just tell her when they're coming. But the other reason why it's so elongated, it's because I think Israel has made such an effort to treat these as isolated incidents of as legal battles that are isolated. It is cloaked into this framework that there's democracy here, that you can appeal this and you can protest this and you can sue us and all of this. But at the end of the day, legal recourse for Palestinians in an Israeli judicial system is novel because this is a system that was created by and for Israelis. And it's based on ethnic supremacy. And also, let me just say this also, a lot of what bothers me about what is going on is that we constantly keep saying evictions, which is because there's a legal system legitimizing these evictions. However, at the end of the day, it's not an eviction, it's dispossession. Just because there's a framework that enables it, doesn't mean it's not theft. It's not eviction, it is land theft. The same way we can look at many examples of unjust laws, especially in the United States, where things were legislated and made okay legally and were incredibly morally reprehensible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The language matters. The term eviction is so neutral and seems to be so technical, and what this really is expulsion and dispossession. What's always been striking to me about this idea that Palestinians have to pursue their rights in Israeli courts, and anyone who follows Jerusalem knows this story well. I mean, you have a set of laws that are designed to defend and promote the ability of Jewish citizens of Israel to get back to have, again, this right of return, while Palestinians are prevented even staying in their own homes. And we have one question in the chat box already about the absentee property law. So I want to get to that in a little bit. But first, Fayrouz, I want to come back to you. Talk to me about why settlers are targeting Sheikh Jarrah. Why are they doing it? When did it start? Because it didn't start with Mohammed's family. I mean, this has been a long effort. And what has been the role of successive Israeli governments? And I don't want you to give like an hour long, because I know we could go for 2 hours on just this, but I mean, this goes back to before the peace process. This goes back when they had the Shamgar Commission and all that. Talk a little bit about how entrenched this effort is and where you think it comes from.
Thank you. I think, first of all, that it's important to understand the case of Sheikh Jarrah, not just the case of those 28 families in Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is a very strategic neighborhood. It is just outside of the old city. It is just north of the old city. And it is between the western occupied part of Jerusalem and the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus and the French Hill colony settlement right next to it, including, of course, the Hadassah Hospital. So Sheikh Jarrah strategically is wanted by the Zionist state. It's not wanted only by settlers. And here I will elaborate a little bit more about these different actors or seemingly different actors that are involved in these stories. But first of all, Sheikh Jarrah is a very strategic neighborhood. So it is important for Israel and not just for the settlers to connect Sheikh Jarrah to the western side of Jerusalem through the ethnic cleansing of as many Palestinians as possible. So the idea is gentrification, to make it understandable for people sitting in the US. That's gentrification. So around the old city, there is an economic colonization of Jerusalem. So not only Palestinian businesses being suffocated and shut down, but also Israeli businesses moving in. Now we have branches of Israeli chains and Israeli businesses opening in our own Zahra Street and Salah ad-Din Street. So that is the certain type of colonization that is happening there. Right next to it, what Israel wishes to do is to ethnically cleanse Sheikh Jarrah, make it a Jewish neighborhood, make it a neighborhood where all the Zionist settlements and colonies are connected together and are all over the neighborhood. So we already have the border police headquarters. Right in front of it, we have Amanaz headquarters or convention center or whatever it is that they built with old Palestinian stones that
And you should say Amana is the body of the settler movement itself.
Yes, Amana is the biggest, if I'm not mistaken, settler movement and organization whose goal and slogan is 1 million settlers. They want to reach 1 million settlers in the West Bank. They are not so far from that goal. Right now, it's nearing 800. Counting, of course, the settlements in Jerusalem. So back to Sheikh Jarrah, it's important to connect these with the settlement that is being built in the Shepherd Hotel, together with the settlements and settler homes around Mohammed's house, in addition to a yeshiva that is now also being built there right next to the National Insurance Institutions building that was built there as well. So it's a combination. This is a big puzzle of Israeli Zionizing efforts of Sheikh Jarrah. Now, when we talk about different actors, I'm afraid that there is the wrong image in people's heads that we are talking about different actors that might be balancing each other in this picture. You have the settlers on one side, and people might imagine them as the crazy settlers that are burning down Palestinian homes with families in them, or the ones who are cutting off olive trees all over the West Bank and poisoning sheep and whatnot. Yes, these crazy settlers exist, but when we talk about settlers, we're talking about the settler movement. We are talking about settler organizations. We are talking about institutions that are very well funded and very well backed, not only by generous donors, but also by the Israeli authorities. And then we have the Israeli authorities that people also might imagine as, you know, they're maybe neutral or they're not as bad as the settlers. But here again, we're talking about legislation. We're talking about laws that are tailored to promote colonial projects and goals in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine. So they work hand in hand. And then there is the judicial system that again creates the wrong impression and image of Israel as a democracy. And there is a watchdog that is the judicial system that says, oh no, we protect human rights. But again, they follow Israeli legislation that is decided by the government and the parliament, and this legislation is tailored again. I mean, a state that identifies as the Jewish state, of course, is going to discriminate against non-Jews. And this is what is happening everywhere, all over Palestine, using different judicial systems, the military one and the civil one. And then we're not talking about three different actors we are talking about three complementary actors. They are all part of one system that we, the Palestinians, are facing in Jerusalem and in Palestine in general. I mean, let's take Sheikh Jarrah, and I'm sorry this answer is taking a bit longer, but I really would like to provide some examples so people can really see the picture. Take Sheikh Jarrah, for example. Who are the two heroes of the settler movement in Sheikh Jarrah? Aryeh King and Itamar Ben Gvir. Now, Aryeh King, he's known or nicknamed the godfather of settlement in Jerusalem. He is a very extreme settler who established the so-called Israel Land Fund, which is promoting, of course, colonization and settlement building everywhere in Palestine, especially the West Bank and Jerusalem. Aryeh King is the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Now, Itamar Ben Gvir, he is a parliament member. Itamar Ben Gvir, he leads the Utzma Yehudit party. He is also a lawyer who is known for defending crazy settlers, quote unquote, in Israeli courts. So here is a perfect example of how these are not three different systems. This is one system with the same actors filling different positions, wearing different hats. And it's important to understand that what we are facing in Jerusalem is this very well netted, very well oiled machine that has different parts that are playing, different players play in different parts, but that complete one big effort. And that is, again, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Jerusalem through dispossession, through displacement, through land confiscation and home demolition and evictions, like what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah.
Muted. I would add two things. Just thought of as I just was quickly checking to make sure before I say this. Itamar Ben Gvir is also a former member of Kahanei Chai. I'm pretty sure he was on the US list, Kahanei Chai being a US designated foreign terrorist organization. That was in his youth, but to get a sense of the politics of the person. The other thing, and Mohammed referenced this in passing a minute ago, when you said, Mohammed, that people risk not only losing their homes, but they risk potentially losing their Jerusalem IDs. So when people are talking about recourse to Israeli courts and Israeli law, it's worth remembering the Palestinians who live in Sheikh Jarrah, who've been there since before 1948, many of them, since the 50s here, since before 67 for sure, aren't Israeli citizens. They have Israeli residency, which in theory, grants them the privilege of living in Israel, but not the rights of full citizens. And there's a constant, I don't know if either of you want to talk about this, it's not something we had decided to talk about, but this idea that Palestinians in East Jerusalem can become citizens like that if they want to is actually not true. So you're not even full status in court. So it's a very problematic idea that there's going to be justice in Israeli courts there. Staying with you, Fayrouz, for a second, can you, going back to the last question I asked Mohammed, looking at these specific cases, which are sort of the catalyst for today's conversation, do you think there's any hope of stopping these dispossessions, these expulsions in the short or long term? And is there any sort of relief for these families who are living in perpetual limbo under attack from these efforts?
Yeah, I think that Mohammed already kind of answered this question. When his mom says, I wish they'd just tell me when they're coming. There is the feeling, unfortunately and very sadly, that this temporary freeze on the eviction order is just a temporary freeze, and eventually the order will come out again. And this is the case of Palestinians in the Israeli judicial system all the time. It is, as Mohammed was saying, it is draining, it is exhausting, and not only, of course, materially and financially, but also psychologically. But imagine, it is it's important to understand that the judicial system follows the Israeli legislation. And when it comes to Israeli legislation about Jerusalem especially, and about Palestinian legal status in Jerusalem and ownership rights over properties in Jerusalem, then clearly the Israeli laws were designed in order to promote the Israeli officially declared goal for Jerusalem, which is having a Jewish majority of 70%. I mean, when a state, of course, it doesn't miss the chance to show off being the only democracy in the Middle East, but look at its legislation, its laws, its policies. It's very, very, very undemocratic. And this is like me being generous. And then you look at the legislation, you look at the laws, you look at what rules is this judicial system going to follow and to go by. And then you realize that we are not the underdogs. We lose the case before even going to court. But this is what Palestinians do, because this is their last resort, going to the Israeli court, usually knowingly that this is only to halt an eviction or a demolition. This is just a temporary pushing, back the day. But eventually it is statistically also clear that we lose cases in this system. And it's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising that we don't stand a chance at the Israeli courts, because eventually, again, they are part of the system that is designed in order to push us out, to dispossess us and push us out. So unfortunately, there isn't much hope legally, and looking at so many other cases of land confiscation, when your land is confiscated for a national park plan, for example, or when you get a demolition order over a house because you supposedly built it without a permit that you were denied systematically by the Israeli authorities, then you see how it is a puzzle. And so you have the authorities making the rules that we don't stand a chance. And then we try to advocate, and then we try to use whatever tools we have. Usually this costs us a lot of money, a lot of life and time, a lot of emotions. And eventually, unfortunately, we also still lose. So that's the case, and that's the feeling. And that's why many Palestinians, sometimes you do it really because it's your last resort, but many Palestinians stopped even trying to go to court in so many other cases.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, I remember years ago when I was first working in Israel, Palestine, coming across the term, which was rule of law versus rule by law. And the idea that there can be a system where everything is legal, but the laws have been written to achieve a specific goal, and then you say it's legal. And I'll also add, I lived in Jerusalem in the early 90s, and I lived in Shafat. And I remember at the time they started building a huge settlement right next to the neighborhood I was living in, which was called Rechesh Shafat, and it became Ramat Shlomo. And I remember digging into the history of that settlement, and that land had been seized in, I think, 68 by Israel from the village of Shafat as a protected land for park, like a protected area. And then at some point they just rezoned it, but then they gave it for a settlement. So it was taken from the village for a different reason. And then again, rule by law, we've changed our mind, and legally we can rezone it, but now it's not used for, the Palestinians have lost all claim to it. It was quite shocking to me as an American at the time. I was naive then.
If I may, Shara, just add to this just one or two sentences. Looking at urban planning policies in Jerusalem, you see this happen over and over again. The land is privately owned by Palestinians. It is confiscated and declared as a green zone, open scenic area, or designated for a national park. By the way, the land, which is also just outside my window that you are referring to, was also designated once, or decided once, to become the Jerusalem football stadium, soccer stadium, Teddy, which later moved on to Al-Malha lands in the south. So you see how very systematically planning, developing Palestinian communities, building Palestinian homes, or developing Palestinian commercial centers does not happen. very systematically, while on the same lands, what happens is dispossession and building more colonies and colonial projects like settler roads and industrial zones and malls. Now, next to Shu'fat on the other side, there is a Rami Levy Mall, which is an Israeli economic colony in this case. So clearly, the designing of the city itself follows those colonial goals.
Yeah. Mohammed, I want to come back to you. So I've got a couple of questions, but I want to start with, so I and a lot of the world with, 2009, this sort of started to heat up. And I think the footage in the movie is from 2009. It was released a little bit later. And at that time, there was rallying support. I remember there were people, Israelis protesting in Sheikh Jarrah, trying to defend against this. Can you talk about what happened back in that era that actually was maybe effective in preventing, full expulsion at the time and drawing people's attention, and what you think, the international community and others can be doing to help stop the expulsion now?
So in 2009, when our house was first taken alongside 3 other homes, partially in 2008, the rest of them in 2009, what started the movement to save Sheikh Jarrah from dispossession was, the women of my neighborhood who opted to use the pots and pans in the houses and go out in the streets and protest what is going on. And that catalyzed and got a lot of people going. A lot of people started to come to Sheikh Jarrah and protest with us, which generated a lot of media attention, which in turn created international outrage. But I wouldn't say that those things stopped. My neighborhood is one of the many documentaries made, maybe one of the better known, but one of the many documentaries made about Sheikh Jarrah. There was a lot of conversation internationally about Sheikh Jarrah. And still, it didn't stop the evictions. It halted them for a few years. And as we see, we are still back into the grinding machine, which kind of proves my point that I made earlier about how it is intentionally drawn out. I believe Israel understands the news cycle. They understand how journalism works. They understand how people's solidarity work. People will get tired. People will come to Sheikh Jarrah for a year, for 2 years, and then khalas, it's no longer a hot button issue. It's no longer an urgent crisis, and they go, and then another village is attacked and people go there. And people forget about Sheikh Jarrah, and the residents of Sheikh Jarrah are the ones left to deal with all of the aftermath. But it's not an anomaly. It's not a unique case. This is not just Sheikh Jarrah. It's the way they operate. They give us the information that we're getting thrown out of our home. We make a fuss about it, and then they disappear for a few months, a year, 2 years. And then when they finally come to throw us out of our home, we've already made a fuss. Not everybody's interested in listening about Sheikh Jarrah anymore because it's out of the news cycle, which is why I am working alongside a lot of my friends and allies, working really hard to try to create another international media campaign against dispossession in Sheikh Jarrah. But I think it's important, it's so necessary, and I can talk about this a little bit more later, but I think it's so necessary for us to escape this framework of legality when we talk about Sheikh Jarrah, and to escape this, my family is suffering. My family has suffered, not for the 11 years since 2009. My father has suffered 4 years even before the establishment of Israel. He has suffered all of his life. My grandmother as well. My family is suffering, but the tragedy, the human tragedy of my family is not the end all be all of this situation. What it is that my family is likely going to be thrown out of our home in the streets. And because it's our home, we're going to protest it. And we're going to put up a tent and sit in the tent. And because we live in Jerusalem, an increasingly gentrified city, the Jerusalem municipality will come and say that it's illegal for us to have a tent. And then we'll not have a tent, and the winter is going to harden, and we're inevitably going to have to move to the West Bank, and we're going to lose our Jerusalem IDs. And the thesis in here, the breaking news about this is that this human tragedy is not just mine. This is likely going to happen to many families after my family, and this has happened thousands and thousands of times to many, many families whose homes were demolished or taken over. So I think in order for us to kind of mobilize our efforts as an international community, we have to start thinking about this as an issue of disposition, as an issue of ethnic displacement, not just an eviction that is happening because of a flaw in the Israeli legal system. No, this is happening because of the design of the Israeli legal system. And to answer this a little bit more materially in terms of what the international community can do, you know, Israel receives $3.8 billion in aid every year from the United States. I don't think there is a bigger punchline than that. I think there's nothing more tangible than that. I think the American people, if they were able to understand, if the American people had the chance to observe what is going on, I'm assertive they wouldn't want to be spending $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year to demolish my home and dispossess me and my family and thousands of other families. I say this in addition to the fact that we are in a pandemic where working class American families are struggling, where Flint doesn't have clean water, where the healthcare system is crumbling. So I think it's a very obvious equation, and I think it doesn't take much to figure out.
It's a really powerful point. And I also, I mean, you make a really important point, which I think is worth repeating. I mean, this webinar is about the case overall. We're focusing on you in large part because you and your family have been able to elevate these ideas and make people stand up and take notice, but it isn't just about you, and you've never made it just about you. I would also say when we're talking about, I mean, you haven't used the word in this webinar, you used it in your article. We talk about ethnic cleansing, right? This evacuation, this expulsion of people, it isn't even just theoretical. Around the US election day, we saw an entire community erased in the Jordan Valley, and it was all legal. We see Han al-Ahmar, which again, this is one of those cases where the international community got very, very engaged against the expulsionist community that's just outside of Jerusalem. But if you talk to people in Brussels, the Europeans became very engaged in stopping the expulsion. They're very clear. Everyone says, well, it's going to happen eventually. And by the time it happens, there's not a lot of energy and political capital left to spend because you spent it before delaying it. And it's a very effective, if it's not a deliberate tactic, which it may well be, even if it's not, it's a very effective way of sort of whittling down opposition. So by the time you actually do something, there's no opposition left, which is exhausting to even think about. Mohammed, I want to stay with you and have you talk about some of the ideas that were in your most recent article, which is entitled, "Why Are Palestinians Being Forced to Prove Their Humanity?" And I said to you before, I found this article just breathtaking, like a punch in the gut. You know, I know the things you're talking about. Can you talk about a little bit your ideas here, and particularly your experience, because you are, I think, widely seen as a very attractive voice in how you have come at this, because how you've engaged the international community. You've been just so constructive and peace-loving and all that, which is awesome. Talk about why that is problematic and how even with that approach, you've had your reception has been, I think, shocking from some people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I'm glad I can answer it in very concrete terms. Somebody can look at me and see my eyes, see my mouth, see my face, and not see a human being. That is not somebody worth engaging. Fundamentally, I do not understand why there's a burden for Palestinians to constantly have to humanize ourselves. And in that humanization, we are shrinking ourselves and we are showing ourselves as victims and victims through and through, and people who are armless and people who are without advocacy. And while these things are true in terms of statistics and in terms of who has arms and who doesn't have arms and who is the occupier and who's the occupied, Palestinians should be able to carry themselves in the struggle as people who can advocate for themselves. You know, if my house is taken, I'm allowed to be outraged about it. I'm allowed to call the people who are taking it whatever they need to be called. I am allowed to say whatever I want to say about it. What frustrates me is not the advocacy for Sheikh Jarrah, because that is something that I am going to do for the rest of my life. And it's also something that I have the privilege to do as a person who speaks English in the United States. and as a person who has a privilege to have access and people who want to listen to me. So I'm going to, like, if I'm given a platform, I will speak against this position. That is out of the question. What bothers me is the negotiations that take place before I can even speak about the dispossession. When I talk about my house being taken in Jerusalem, people are so shocked. It's such a bizarre thing, when in fact it shouldn't be bizarre. But it is so bizarre because people refuse to think of Israel as a colonial state. To use a term most Americans will be familiar with, apartheid. And I say apartheid very, very generously. You know, Israel is far more than an apartheid state. But there is clear evidence that Israel is not a democratic state, that Israel has an agenda, has had an agenda for decades, to completely erase Palestinian presence from Jerusalem, from Palestine at large. And I'm not interested in negotiating that fact. It is a fact. The Nakba is a fact. The fact that we were expelled from our homes in 1948 and never stopped being expelled from our homes is a fact. I am not interested in negotiating that fact. And I'm also not interested in trying to appease people from a legal standpoint. What is happening here is that our houses are getting taken. And I'm so tired of having to qualify that takeover of the house with citing my little sister having a panic disorder and my father being almost 80 years old and my mother worrying, because these are the things that human beings will feel. All of my American friends, all of the people watching can imagine. I'm sure they can. They probably couldn't feel it, but they can imagine if 80 soldiers, like from head to toe covered in ammunition, just knocked down the doors and forcibly threw you in the streets, scraped your body with the concrete. You can imagine how dehumanizing that is. You can imagine how undignifying that is. You don't need to put the burden on me to convince you of my humanity. If you are having me, and I say you obviously broadly, but if you are having me as a person to speak about an anti-Palestinian dispossession, you need to hear me speak about the policies. You need to hear me speak about the strategies. You need to hear me speak about our resistance. I can talk about the grief but the grief is so adamant and obvious that it doesn't need much explanation. But you know, the need for humanization stems from the fact that there is dehumanization. And if we don't address the dehumanization directly, which is Israel, we are always going to have dehumanized people. We are always going to have undignified people. So I wrote the 972 essay because I wanted people to shift their attention from the framework of, you know, how sad and heartbreaking such things are, which they are. They're very sad and heartbreaking, and you know, we can pretend to be desensitized to them, but we are not. We are living in constant fear and agony and anxiety. But at the same time, if we keep our attention to that human aspect, and if we keep burdening Palestinians with having to humanize themselves because people are too racist to see them as human beings, we are missing the point entirely. We're missing the point that there's a system, a well-oiled system, like Fayrouz said, that is working day and night, 24/7, tirelessly, and by design, to completely remove all Palestinian presence from our native city. So that is why I wrote that essay.
So thank you for that. And I want to really encourage people to read it. One of the things that I found really, again, breathtaking reading it was, you know, and I think we all have to reflect with humility when, and I do. You mentioned at one point that you almost cited, you cite indirectly, say, I almost cited this Israeli and this Israeli. And it really hit home for me as, you know, someone who is progressive on this, who's talking about it. And that sense that, well, to say these things, we have to always find an Israeli validator. So like when you mention apartheid now, I find myself wanting to jump in and say, well, Michael Sfard has issued an opinion saying it's apartheid, because somehow having that Israeli Jewish validator somehow says, well, it's not just the Palestinians saying it, because and it's such a, it's so dehumanizing, right? To not just say Palestinians can talk about this in their own terms, this is their lived experience. And it's even more of a problem, I think, right now, when you have things like an international effort to promote a definition of anti-Semitism, which literally defines the Palestinian lived experience as anti-Semitic. I mean, that's where we're moving to. So I hope people will read this essay and really take a step back and reflect on what it means to hear people talk about their experience and regard them as human enough to believe them in their terms and not disbelieve them unless you can find a real human to validate it. I think it's incredibly important, and thank you for that, for writing it. Fayrouz, I want to ask you a question, which again, this is more from what we're seeing in the Q&A. I want to ask you to unpack a little bit the legal framework that lets this all happen. And I want to, I know this is, again, something that could go on for hours, but there's these laws, there's the absentee property law, there's residency rules, there's building rules. Can you unpack a little bit what is the framework that enables this dispossession?
Yes, so again, specifically speaking about Sheikh Jarrah, we are talking about claims that land or homes were owned by Jewish people in this side, the eastern part of Jerusalem, prior to the Nakba. And since we're talking about the legal framework, I mean, first of all, speaking about these refugees in Sheikh Jarrah, you know, one person I met there once said, you know what, I don't want this house in Sheikh Jarrah. I want to go back to Lid. She's a refugee from Lid. And she says, why? Why are Jewish people allowed to reclaim or return to their property? Now, again, leaving the discussion whether this is factually true or not, because there is a discussion on those claims of ownership, whether of the land or homes in Sheikh Jarrah. But again, it's important to highlight the double standard that is being used here. Palestinian refugees cannot claim their property that is in 48 occupied lands legally. We cannot. My grandfather couldn't reclaim his lands around Al-Fahim or Nazareth. Mohammed's grandfather and mother cannot claim back their homes in Haifa or Nazareth or anywhere else they were expelled from, while Jewish people can use this legal right that is supported by the Israeli judicial system that accepts this. And so there is the case of double standards here. But again, look at it on the wider, bigger picture. The whole idea of return, one of the first laws that were legislated following the Nakba is the Israeli so-called law of return that speaks about the return of any Jewish person, whether they were ever here or not, whether they are now, regardless whether they are Jewish or not sometimes, but just claiming to be Jewish and coming here, then happily largely being accepted based on a law that was designed in order to encourage and push forward Zionist immigration to Palestine. So any person who can prove that they are Jewish can come here very easily, be very welcome, and receive the citizenship legal status, receive help by the so-called absorption agency, and become Israeli. But Palestinian refugees who were expelled from their lands and from their homes, people who can still even legally prove that they own these lands and these homes, are not allowed back into Palestine to begin with by Israel. They are banned from returning to Palestine. These Palestinian refugees today, they are millions around the world, almost 7 million Palestinian refugees around the world. These are descendants of Palestinians who were expelled from Palestine in 48 and who legally cannot, according to the legal system that controls all of Palestine, which is the Israeli legal system, they cannot use this. Even again, I am not a believer in international law. Many Palestinians do not believe in international law. But even according to international law, these Palestinians have the right to return to Palestine. There is a UN decision that says, resolution that says they must be allowed back into Palestine, and it is not being respected because the Israeli legal system says otherwise. So you have the return of Jewish people, whether this return is debated or not, but there is no way that Palestinians can return. And then to complement this policy and legislation comes the absentee property law that was in the question. The absentee property law was legislated in 1950 in order to regulate Israel's control over Palestinian property that was left behind by expelled refugees, whom Israel
regulate sounds like a very neutral term. I think,
Sorry, I mean enable.
yeah.
Okay, enabling the robbery, legal robbery of this property, because the physical robbery already happened, right? These refugees are stuck now outside of Palestine. They cannot return, and Israel creates a law that allows it to legally take over these properties, whether we are speaking about lands, homes, businesses, even bank accounts back then in 1948. And these are deemed by the Israeli law absentee properties. Again, absentee, a very neutral word that entails that these Palestinians are just, absent on their own terms, because based on their own will. And until their return, the Israeli authorities control their property. This is the language in the law. Now, you can do 1+1. These refugees are not allowed to return to Palestine, which means Israel controls their property indefinitely. Now, this absentee property law was first used in 48 occupied lands and was applied when it came to Palestinian refugees of 48 and their properties located in the western part of Jerusalem, in other 48 occupied territories. In 2013, a very important legal precedent happened when the Israeli court allowed this law to be applied in the eastern part of Jerusalem. So we started seeing, the case of the Shepherd Hotel in Sheikh Jarrah, which was confiscated, it used to belong to Al-Husseini family. It is, part of it, Israel claims is absentee property, and now applying absentee property also in 67 occupied lands. Israel legally, again, quote unquote, of course, grabbed this property and is now finishing the construction of a new residential settlement in Sheikh Jarrah, added to the whole collection we already mentioned. So the absentee property law, to the question that was asked, is now, yes, being applied in the eastern part of Jerusalem. To those who are familiar with the police station and the post office building on Salah ad-Din Street, just outside of Herod's Gate, that also, Ateret Kohanim managed to take a floor in this building based on the use of this absentee property law as well, also in the eastern part of Jerusalem. So looking at Israeli laws, you can see how these laws are designed in a way, again, to work together towards the dispossession of Palestinians, displacing them. Master plans for Jerusalem speak about maintaining and keeping a Jewish majority of 70%. Just think of the idea. Imagine any other country, anywhere around the world that says, I am going to limit the number of a certain population group in a certain city, and imagine how ridiculous that is going to sound to people. And imagine how Israel can say it boldly, shamelessly, and there isn't a question about it. So what do you mean? You mean that you are going to not allow Palestinians to grow beyond a certain number. And how do you do that? By the use of legislation, policies, urban planning, and so on and so forth. The legal status, in just a few words, that Palestinians hold in Jerusalem, it is called the residency status. People imagine a residency status as one step towards a citizenship, while for us as Palestinians, it is the first tool of displacement that was designed to push Palestinians out of Jerusalem, because you have to fulfill a whole list of criteria that include physically living in Jerusalem, studying in Jerusalem, receiving medical care in Jerusalem, staying in Jerusalem. While you cannot do all of this because the Israeli authorities are not building you enough homes, but demolishing your homes. They are not building enough schools. They are not building enough medical centers. So they are pushing us out of Jerusalem to look for these services and then saying, oh, we have a law about it. The law says if you move out of Jerusalem, then legally you are not entitled to this residency status. We will take it. Thank you very much. You go live somewhere else. 15,000 Palestinians were displaced from Jerusalem by losing this legal status exactly this way. So it's important to see that even when the language is neutral or the language sounds like your own country and not like the US is a great country when it comes to laws and citizen rights, but I think that many times people hear familiar terms and think, yeah, this is the case in any democracy. Well, in this so-called democracy, it is designed to push Palestinians out.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, for when Americans hear this, I think if most Americans face the prospect of, if you go and live in France for a year and study French, you may lose your right to return to your home because you don't live here anymore. I mean, that's just nonsensical. I'd also add, for people who are listening to Fayrouz and don't know this issue quite as well in the legal stuff, you know, the question of rule by law has been really illustrated quite openly by the Israeli government in the past few years with their efforts to legalize Israeli settlers' actions in the West Bank that were done in contravention of Israeli law. And effectively, when they ran out of all possible bureaucratic ways to legalize the illegal acts of the settlers, they changed the law. They literally wrote legislation to suspend rule of law to allow things that are illegal to now become legal. It's almost like a textbook example of what this means if you take it to its logical conclusion. So we are about at the end. I'm going to run a little bit over because I want to ask each of you a final question. It's a similar question. I'm going to start with Fayrouz. I'm going to ask you both to be relatively brief because we're hitting the end. I want you to talk about what justice would look like for Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. And I know you're going to want to expand it beyond Sheikh Jarrah. That's fine. But how can the international community stand with Palestinians, not only on Sheikh Jarrah, but on Jerusalem in general? What does that look like? Is it advocacy? Is it donations? Is it education? And do you have any specific recommendations for organizations like your own that people should be following?
Well, thank you. So I'll try to be brief. Well, first of all, justice for Palestinians, not only for people in Sheikh Jarrah, is freedom and self-determination. For Palestinian refugees everywhere, and not only the ones in Sheikh Jarrah, justice begins with return. So specifically for the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah that are now facing the threat of becoming refugees for the 5th, 6th, 7th time, justice is not to be evicted from Sheikh Jarrah. Justice is to be able to return to the villages and homes and lands from which they were expelled in 1948. Now, justice for Palestinians means freedom and self-determination. And this can happen by us Palestinians self-empowering our own communities, organizing our communities, mobilizing and networking. And in order for us to be supported, people need to understand that volunteering and donating are important, but they are equal to humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid helps us survive under occupation, does not help us end the occupation and achieve our liberation and self-determination. And I think what's very important, advocacy and campaigning is very important, but I think what's to me very important to say is that people need to start seeing the correlation between internal politics and internal political reality in their own countries and our political reality as Palestinians. The worse it becomes for people of color in the US, for indigenous people in the US, then this means that the US policy on Palestine and positions on Palestine are also going to be worse. And I think that people need to see the correlation because we are eventually facing a common enemy, and that is the economic colonization of our communities. And it's the capitalism that is moving political agendas and dictating political realities that we live in. And I think that people need to understand that organizing the House, if I'm speaking mainly to the United States public right now, then organizing the House in the United States is going to inevitably also affect the United States positions on Palestine. As long as you have a president who no longer a president, but you had a president who for many years felt that he could speak the way he could in a racist, fascist way freely and be the president of the United States, then of course this government and this administration is going to have very bad positions on Palestine. It's going to send aid to Israel. It is going to move its embassy to Jerusalem. It's going to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's going to visit on an official visit in settlements. This follows the politics at home. So I think that if people don't want to mobilize for Palestine, then people should mobilize for themselves, because as Mohammed said before, those $3.8 billion, I am sure, are needed to build infrastructure for so many communities back in the US.
I think that's a really, really powerful point. And I would add, I think more Americans are starting to understand that, even Americans who don't follow Israel-Palestine closely, as they see the Israel-Palestine issue being used as a weapon to target liberal freedoms, the right to protest, free speech, all of that. And I think, I hope there's some growing awareness, because effectively, you know, the Palestinians are already feeling the spear, right, that's coming at the right to protest and free speech. But it's going to come through the Palestinians and hit everybody else too. So even if you don't care about Palestinians, the best thing you can do is defend liberal, you know, democratic rights, and then, you know, frankly, everybody benefits. Mohammed, I want to come to you, and I want you to also talk about the question of justice. And I want you to answer this from the perspective of somebody who has been, from a ridiculously young age, out there making the case internationally, in effect campaigning, being a voice and face of Palestinians to the world. What does Israel, what does the world need to do for justice and for peace? You always have talked, when I've heard you previously, you are very careful, always talking about the desire for peace and coexistence and all that. What does that mean? What do you want people to take away from this as their last thought?
Well, I'll start by saying thank you both for the excellent points you made about the Israeli legal system. I want to say that it's been entrenched. Palestinians have been talking about this for decades. It's in our proverbs. You know, I grew up and my grandmother would constantly say, "Is gharimak al-qadi lam tishki." You know, if the judge is your aggressor, to whom do you complain? Right? We are living practically and being ruled practically by people who do not want us there. And that's incredibly important to understand, which takes me to my second point about justice. When it comes to Sheikh Jarrah materially, I would like, not only would I like to not be evicted of my house alongside the 12 other families, I would also like to see the 3 other families that have been evicted return to their homes. I will say this more explicitly. I would like to see the settlers in half of my home leave, like permanently leave, because they have no claim, no right to my house. Like, I don't even need to justify it. They just need to leave. That is my first step. And, you know, peace, I think growing up and coming to college and reading and have offered me a better understanding of what peace necessitates. And I would love to live peacefully. But I think that has so many prerequisites that Fayrouz has talked about earlier. But for us to be able to live peacefully, we first need to address this not as a conflict, but as an issue of a people who are occupied and a people who are occupying those people, so we can understand the power dynamics better, who is the aggressor and who is the responder, who is the actor and who is a person that reacts to these things. To put this in very abstract terms. So I think in order for us to achieve peace, we would have to have the right of return. We would have to have all Palestinian prisoners freed. We would have to address all of these illegal settlements, and all of these settlements, regardless of whether they're not cloaked in legislation. There's so much that needs to be addressed. And I think in terms of freedom of speech and talk and right to protest, Palestinians have been silenced for decades. And the last thing, as a Palestinian movement and as allies for Palestinians and justice and freedom and peace, the last thing we should do is let such a racist definition of anti-Semitism prevail in silencing us. You know, I recently made Twitter, and I cannot formulate a tweet without Googling if a certain adjective I used is a trope or not. And I don't think anyone should have to feel that. So I feel like justice also should entail me being able to speak about my oppressor the way I want without worrying about repercussion. Because it doesn't matter if I'm angry at Israelis, right? It doesn't matter if I'm calling them names. The bigger issue at hand here is that somebody's boot is on my neck and I'm protesting it in the way that I can. And unless that boot is addressed, I can speak about that person whatever way I want. So yeah, I think, but also like Fayrouz said, this is easier to think about when you kind of remove the Palestine-Israel lens, because to a lot of people, this is, you know, a hot button, sensitive, controversial issue. But really, when you remove the word Jewish or Israeli and you remove Palestinian and you just look at this blandly and you look at this in the context of many, many racist regimes in the world, you see how clearly outrageous it is for what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and what is happening across all Palestine. And, you know, it's funny because Fayrouz said she doesn't believe in international law. And I say a similar thing often. I say, like, doesn't matter what you believe in, be it from like a point of view of morality or a point of view of international law or a point of view of legality or a point of view of history or a point of view of religion or whatever point of view, doesn't matter to me. If you look at this situation, it is blatantly wrong. What is going on? It is blatantly wrong that Israel is colonizing Palestinians and ethnically cleansing us. So I think people need to start challenging themselves. I say this with love, but people need to start challenging themselves to think beyond the sensitivities and really look at the material ground, material realities on the ground. And I say this speaking to the many Americans who come from family, who are like excited and sympathetic about the Palestinian cause, and who come from families that aren't necessarily in favor of Palestinians. And I say this to them, you know, no matter how hard, no matter how difficult a dinner is going to become once you mention Palestine, it is never going to be as hard as the reality that Palestinians live under the ground. So I really challenge people to push themselves. Sorry, I went over time. That's it.
No, you did. You gave me a chill. That was me. I was trying to figure out what I was going to say to round this up, and then you just spoke that last sentence, and you gave me a chill. I hope everyone who is on this webinar and is listening and really takes seriously what we're hearing here. And I say this most specifically to fellow Americans who are Jewish, who care about this and who see themselves as progressive and as caring about values. But no matter how hard this ever is for us to think about, it's a lot harder for people who are living under these things that are hard for us to talk about and think about. And I am humbled and so grateful for both of you sharing this time with us and sharing your thoughts so honestly. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and Just Vision, I want to thank you both for participating in this webinar. For people who are attending, if you want to learn more about these issues, you should follow both of our guests on Twitter. I think the Twitter handles are in the chat. All of the resources that were posted in the chat will be posted on our website along with the video of this webinar, so you can see more about that. For folks who want to learn more, we are having another webinar in 2 days on the EU and EU policies in Israel-Palestine, looking ahead to Biden. So you should join us for that and keep an eye out for other announcements, which are all found on www.fmep.org. And with that, we will end this webinar. Thank you all so very much. And thanks for everyone who put questions in the chat box. We included a lot of them in the discussion. I will say if your questions were not included, fear not. The entire set of questions will be shared in writing with both of the panelists so that they will know what people are interested in, and that will hopefully help guide them in their thinking and in their engagements in the future. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.